the tunnel. Before we get into the disaster, we need to set the scene of our story. And although tragedy was sprout in 1982, our roots go all the way back to the 1920s. This big thing is the Berkeley Hills. It poses a bit of an obstacle for travelling from east towards San Francisco. Traffic had to snake its way over the hill and down Harwood Canyon. Needless to say, this was less than ideal for efficiency and journey times. As such, over the years, several plans for a tunnel in the area have been bounced about, with works being attempted in the late 1880s. One was even completed for one-way travel in 1903. It was given the name the Inter-County Tunnel, but something more substantial was in the works just 20 years later. In 1926, the counties of Amelia, Contra Costa, and the city of Oakland settled on replacing the old tunnel with a new route through the Berkeley Hills. The initial surveys and groundwork began in 1931, with the first vehicles driving through the tunnel in 1937. The tunnel would become the victim of its own success, rapidly turning the surrounding areas from agricultural to commuter sprawling suburbs. This meant there were more cars on the road, and as such, by the 1960s, another bore was planned. There were around 50,000 vehicles per day travelling through the tunnel in the early 1960s. This amount of traffic was sufficient to require an additional bore. However, in a case of very good forward thinking, land was purchased to accommodate 2 extra bores. So this third bore was completed in 1964 and came with some modern at the time improvements, such as flow reversal, where the direction of traffic could be changed to suit the traffic levels throughout the day, as well as other bits of safety kit. The highway that the tunnel carries is Route 24 and had a maximum speed of 55 miles per hour. However, through the tunnel this speed was reduced to 50 miles an hour. Hazardous materials were allowed to be transported through the tunnel and there were no lane closed indicators within it. If there was an accident, there was no way for anyone entering the tunnel to know until they came across it, which I'm sure created some rather underwear soiling situations. So from now on, when I'm talking about the tunnel, I'm only going to be describing the North Bore, which was the newer one built in the 1960s. And this was the one that would be the setting for our disaster. The tunnel was 3,371 foot long, and from east to west was a downhill gradient. When driving along it, there was a slight bend, then straight section, followed by another bend. This meant that you couldn't see along the entire length of the bore. The floor of the tunnel was made of Portland cement with a groove pattern. This helped with grip and water dispersion. The walls were also covered in the same material. In these kind of tunnels you need to have a clean air supply when vehicles are driving through, and in our case the tunnel's air was drawn in through ductwork on the west side and pumped out on the east side of the tunnel. Each side of the tunnel had a walkway of roughly 2 foot wide. There were CCTV cameras at the entrance and exit to monitor traffic in the control room. However, there were no cameras within the tunnel. There were tunnel telephones evenly spaced throughout the bore, and there were 3 connecting tunnels on the south side wall which allowed people to walk between the bores. Accidents were semi-regular, which is hardly a surprise, being that the route sees over 50,000 cars alone per day. There was an estimated average of around 1 crash per month. Luckily, in the preceding 3 years before 1982, no one had died in any crash in the tunnel. However, this would change on the 7th of April the same year. The disaster. It is the final minutes of the 6th of April 1982, and a 1978 Honda Accord is driving along Route 24. At 12 minutes past 12 on the 7th of April, the car approaches the entrance portal at the east end of the Caldecott Tunnel. The car started to veer and it went out of control, eventually crashing into the tunnel wall. Multiple vehicles following were able to avoid colliding with the Honda. The crashed vehicle had come to a rest in the left lane, or the fast lane. The driver got out to inspect the damage. Her car had caused a bit of an obstacle, hindering the traffic flow and creating a pinch point. Just a few minutes later, a tanker pulling a tanker trailer entered the tunnel, followed quickly by an empty school bus behind it. The crash site was roughly half the way down the tunnel. After the first bend, the tanker was doing about 45 miles an hour. It reached the crashed car and it slammed into the rear of the Honda. The sudden stop resulted in the following bus crashing into both the Honda and the tanker. In the impact, the bus driver was thrown out through the windscreen. The bus, although now sans driver, continued on out the tunnel, coming to a rest on the western end. Fuel was now leaking from the tanker's tank trailer. The driver saw this, and after discovering that his truck was immovable, he decided to escape the tunnel. The pooling fuel was ignited and flames started licking around the truck. Fuel was also flowing down the tunnel's drainage system, but as fuel flowed down, smoke from the increasing fire started driving up the gradient. Like what we saw in the Capron disaster, the tunnel became a massive chimney. The effect of this was that cars entering the tunnel were quickly hit with a wall of all-consuming smoke. Some were lucky and managed to reverse out safely, but 4 vehicles were consumed by the smoke. This was another truck, 2 pickups and a car. One of the pickup's occupants left the vehicle and started walking uphill. They made it to an emergency phone, where they were able to call for help, but the flames grew and thus the smoke, and they were succumbed to by the noxious fumes. Meanwhile, the CCTV feed had caught the driverless bus exit the tunnel and was observed by the tunnel control room crew. The alarm was raised and the California Highway Patrol and fire services were informed. Fire services entered the scene and ordered the storm drain valves be closed to allow fuel to flow out of the tunnel. By around 1 a.m, a 2-man crew in protective equipment entered the tunnel and started discovering bodies. In total, 7 were found. This included the Honda driver, the bus driver, 2 from a truck, 2 from a car, and another one from a pickup. The fire had caused damage to the tunnel's water main. Thus, it made using water to extinguish the fire an almost impossible task. Because of this, the decision was made to let the fire just burn out. This would finally be over by just before 3 a.m. The tunnel was significantly damaged, however its structural integrity wasn't affected. Tiles on the wall, communications cabling and water pipes were damaged and would require replacement. The bore was shut for months, whilst a couple $1 million repair job was undertaken. Of course, the crash had to be investigated, and this welcomes a big-time channel friend, the NTSB, to our story. The investigation. As part of the investigation efforts, the wrecked cars were pulled from the tunnel and poured over. After this, a crash sequence was finalised, which is what I used to base the disaster portion of this video on. The dead were autopsied, and all but one had died from smoke inhalation. The odd one out was the launched bus driver. Interestingly, the cause of the Honda's erratic driving was found. The driver was over the legal drink-drive limit. So that was the cause. It was rather simple. But initially the crash had caused no one injured. The Honda driver was able to get out and check the damage after all. So that means the wider disaster is down to a more infrastructure problem. Clearly, it was the lack of information available to the preceding vehicles. The NTSB would state this in their probable cause section after putting the initial blame on the drunken driver. Also contributing to the severity of the accident and injuries were the lack of adequate monitoring capabilities and variable message signs or traffic signs at the entrance of the tunnel and within the tunnel, and lack of communication system between the tunnel personnel and tunnel occupants, which if present might have facilitated occupant evacuation. In the aftermath, a few safety improvements were brought in, which included better accident information for road users and one big one, which was limiting hazardous material trucks from travelling through the tunnel to only between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. This pretty much forced all dangerous goods vehicles out of the tunnel to then find an alternative route. This pretty much forced all hazardous vehicles to just avoid the tunnel altogether. So that's my video on the Caldecott Tunnel Fire. It's going to be a 3 on the disaster scale, and this is what I've got for my root cause analysis card. So do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. This is a Plain Default production. All videos on the channel are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Default videos are produced by me, John, in a currently miserable, grey, wet corner of southern London, UK. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and as always, Mr. Music, can you play us out please?